I will be on mute and without my video camera. So please, and if you have any questions, folks, please post them over here in the chat. Both me and Teob are monitoring it and they will not go unanswered. Okay, cool. Thank you. Go ahead,
All
sir.
right. All right. Well, let me go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to assume we're good. Everyone see that? I need a verbal confirmation because everything just got hidden on my screen.
Yeah, I'm looking at your pre-con slide from the
Appreciate it.
past.
Well, as you were talking about PASS, I figured I would throw this up here. This is a pretty recent change. Some of you may know I worked for Redgate for about 2.5 years, and I love the company and love what they've done to continue to support PASS and what have you. And for various reasons, I switched companies. Some because I love what we're doing at PG Analyze, and it's just been good to continue to learn more about Postgres. And so they a session was not able to continue. I don't remember exactly who. And so they reached out and asked if we would do a Postgres tuning course in pre-con. And so we are working on this and really excited to see this come to fruition. So if you're coming to Summit on Tuesday, Lucas and I, who's been the founder of PG Analyze for, it's almost 15 years old at this point, really knows a ton about query planning and Postgres. And it's been, continuing to be a good experience for me as well. We'll be working together. So I'm excited for that. And I think you'll learn a ton about Postgres and how queries really work and ways that you can improve query planning and efficiency. And so think about it. Come on by. All right. So didn't plan to do that, but since you're mentioning it, figured I would. And so we're going to talk about privileges and roles today. It's interesting, as I was waiting on this call, kind of getting ready for the top of the hour, a support request came in for PG Analyze, and it had to do with security and privileges and how roles work in Postgres and just a nuance. And so, it's a situation that comes up pretty frequently. And I would say when I first came to Postgres, there was a lot of things I had to learn that just worked just differently enough that it was really frustrating. And roles and privileges and users was one of those because particularly in cloud environments, some of this gets hidden, and it's the nuance of why something does or doesn't work just is abstract enough that you don't really know exactly where to go figure it out. And so I hope that over the next 45 minutes or so, this will give you that starting place. All right. So feel free to ask questions. I have dividers as we go. I'll try and take questions as I go through that, but just to let you know that. My name is Ryan Booz. I now work at PG Analyze. We are a monitoring solution for Postgres and Postgres only. Actually been around for a number of years. A lot of the work that we do is actually open source. The application itself obviously is not, but the pieces that go into it, things like the collector, which actually connects and gets all the information, is an open source project that you can see and contribute to and whatever you might need to do. There are some tools behind the scenes that Lucas and the team have made available for the last 10 years for things like how to parse a query plan in Postgres. And so it actually takes the code from Postgres. It's an open source tool that actually is available in many different languages that allows you to actually take queries and parse them and get plan trees and other things out of them. So it's a real commitment to Postgres and the open source nature of it. So it's been a lot of fun to be here. I'm generally Ryan Booz everywhere. Now, again, because of my job transition, I have not been very public in the last few months. As the fall comes around, I'll be speaking at various conferences in the US and Europe. And so that will usually spur on some more stuff. So please, give these things a look. The presentation today and most of the presentations I give are in my GitHub repository. You'll see a presentations project, and you can find all of them there, including this one. And then last but not least, just to remind you that Grant Fritchie and I wrote this book last year. We did a pre-release preview at PASS Summit. So some people even on the call were able to get one of those initial books that were printed. There was one major flaw in that initial book because we were rushing to get it done for PASS. It is actually off by a couple of pages because we had reshuffled some things, and yours truly forgot to update the index. And so obviously the actual edition that you can get is all good, and hopefully it's a really good resource. You can actually download the PDF for free from Redgate. I encourage you to do it. If you want a printed copy. You can get it wherever books are sold, but I think it's been a helpful resource to get started. And Grant and I just talked earlier this week, and there will be a second edition most likely before the end of the year. So, all right, so here's what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to go a little bit faster in a couple of these areas just because of time, and I want to really make sure I can do the demo to give everyone that concept of exactly what's going on. But we'll talk about the building blocks, exactly what roles are in Postgres. It's not actually users and groups like you would expect in SQL Server, and why they're different and why you need to understand that. There's a couple special roles that we need to understand. And then for me, the two biggest things here are actually privileges and object ownership. And for me, object ownership, believe it or not, is what caused me to just really dig in to Postgres roles and privileges, because I would get in these situations where my developers couldn't update objects, and I couldn't understand why they couldn't update objects. And so understanding how all these things come together, I think would be really helpful for you. All right, let's talk about the brief building blocks. Basically, in a Postgres cluster, we have the physical server, whether it's a VM, whether it's actually, a cloud provided database. Basically, it's running on some kind of host, and that host has what we call a cluster. And I always say this is the first silly thing that somebody 30 years ago in the Postgres world thought we're going to call the running instance a cluster. And so a cluster of clusters is still a cluster, but an individual Postgres instance is a cluster. But anyway, it's an instance as far as we're concerned. So I can have multiple clusters on a host. They just have to have different ports, right? So again, just like SQL Server, I can have different instances running on different ports. And then every cluster has their own, what we call the HBA file, host-based authentication. And this is the first line of defense. And honestly, the easiest way to think about this is a firewall. So if you can't get past the HBA configuration, you can't even try and connect to Postgres. And so you do need to at least have that configured correctly. And again, your hosted providers like Amazon and Azure and so forth usually make this pretty easy for you. Inside the cluster itself, we basically have two sets of major objects that we care about: roles and databases. And the thing is, they are related. You can't have a database without having a role, and you can't have a role without having a database. They have to coexist. So when Postgres is initialized, it always creates an initial database and an initial owner that owns that database. And the reason is you connect to databases in Postgres. Connections are not to the server. I can't switch between databases freely on a connection. Every connection is directly to a database. And so the database itself has to first exist. You have to have a database to connect to, or you can never connect to Postgres. And you have to have a role that owns a database that can connect to the database. And so that's why we start with always one role and one database, usually called Postgres. And that's probably what you've seen. So HBA, as I said, is that first layer. You may not ever see it as a text file. Usually in a hosted environment, you're doing this through a console or something of that nature. You're opening up, this subnet with this user can connect to this database, something like that. And it really is just that first line of defense. I always refer to it kind of like a firewall rule set. And it simply says which roles and hosts can even connect. And then of those hosts and roles, what databases can they connect to, and what kind of authentication method must they be using in order to connect? What does it all mean? That means that in general, if I look at something really simple, like this first one here, I say it's a host. I'm specifying the Postgres database. I'm saying any user can connect to the Postgres database as long as they're coming from this subnet and they're using that authentication method. And there are multiple authentication methods. There's host authentication. There's what we call Scram. There's MD5, which we don't recommend you use anymore. There's Kerberos and things of that nature. So there are other ways to do authentication within Postgres, but you have to have these things spelled out. And so if the connection begins and it doesn't match any of these rule sets, you'll just get a can't connect, and you'll never have the opportunity. So you just have to kind of get past and beyond that, kind of making it a little bit bigger so you can see what's going on here. There's a really good set of documentation on this that works through all the possibilities, including, as you may notice, you can do things like, regex to actually match multiple things as well. The only thing I would generally say is avoid trust when you install Postgres, even as a Docker image, for instance, something really simple. You will get the initial local connection on that allows trust connection. So I can say peace equal Postgres, and it's happy to do that. That's maybe the only reason I would ever say use trust. If you have a very local container and you're just playing around, like, okay, but don't get in a bad habit. Generally, I say don't do that. Set it up. If you are going to use password authentication, Scram SHA-256 was added, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years ago at this point. And it is the preferred encryption method for your local passwords if you're doing that. Now, anything Postgres, I believe it's 12 and above, 13 and above, by defaults to Scram SHA-256. If you have an older database, there is a method to go from MD5 up to this. Just something to look at, but at least know that as we go. All right, so that is the really quick basics. So we have a Postgres server. We now know that we can get past that kind of firewall. We've set up some kind of rule set. And now we need to talk about who is it that's actually connecting? How can we actually get into this database? And so we have roles. So in Postgres, roles are it. We don't actually have users and groups. Now we do still have, and you'll see this in just a second, we do still have aliases for the SQL commands, create user and create group, but they actually just create roles with the appropriate theoretical properties. And let me tell you what that means. So roles actually own all the objects, functions, tables, databases, schemas. And so this is our primary principle, as it were, to come into. Roles themselves have cluster level attributes. So there are kind of two sets of privileges that a role can have. And so in some ways analogous to SQL Server and how roles work. So roles are created within the cluster. They are cluster level objects, but because the connection is to a database, you have to have a database to connect to, as I said earlier. Now, those roles have these cluster level permissions, things like, can it create a database or not? Can that role give privileges to other roles? Things of that nature, kind of cluster level things. And then once you actually are quote unquote connected to and inside a database, the roles can have unique privileges inside each database schema and so forth. And at times, if they have the right privilege, they can grant privileges to other roles, which you'll see is pretty essential in some cases. So by convention, we generally say a role that can log in is a user, and a role that can't log in is a group. Since Postgres 8.2, we got rid of user and group as an object concept, right? They're all roles. We still have create user group. It's just an alias. And so if you say create group, it creates a role with a no login attribute set. If you create a user, it creates a role with a login attribute set. And that's how it works. So it is all convention. Both of these will work. However, generally, someday in theory, user and group, create user group may get, I think they've been deprecated for a while. They may go away. That will probably never happen. But create role, and then you can specify with login, password, and so forth. So the attributes that I'm talking about are actually defined in the database. You can see them inside of the PG roles table. There's basically a column for every attribute. And these are the current attributes, even as of Postgres 17. Postgres 18 is due out in about 2 months or so, maybe a little bit less. And again, the attributes themselves have not changed. So basically, as a role, can I log in? Am I a super user? We'll talk about that in just a second. Can I create other roles? Can I create databases? What is my password? Can I inherit? And then there's a couple of these other things like connection limit and bypass URLs and so forth. Bypass row level security, sorry. I'm only going to mostly talk about the underlying ones as we work through the next few minutes. The others are useful. Obviously, if you're doing replication, you do need to have a replication login. When you get to those advanced topics, there's just good documentation for that, so I think you'll be okay. And reach out. Look at the book. We talk about replication, or reach out and we can help you that way. All right, so unless you specify otherwise, if I simply say create role and I don't say anything else, except maybe login, that role will be able to inherit privileges, which you'll see in just a minute. And it will have unlimited connections. So again, on these specific attributes, it won't have super user, it won't have create role or create DB, it won't be a replication login, but it will inherit by default, and it will have an unlimited connection limit. So you can set those as needed, but just recognize that if you don't do anything else, this is the bare minimum that will happen. I can connect, I can inherit, and I have unlimited connections. And then the other cool thing, and this is where it gets really, honestly, essential in a lot of ways, particularly on a per database level, is within a database, you can actually set specific role privileges. And so when a role connects to a database, you can say, hey, this role has, well, I think I have an example. This role report user, give it work mem of 256 megabytes anytime it connects. And so maybe you know that this specific role is used on a nightly basis to run a memory intensive report. If you didn't set the work mem higher, it might take an hour to run the report, but you've done some work, you've figured it out, and say, hey, I can set it to 256 and the report runs in 2 minutes. Now, I would never recommend that you set work mem to 256 megs generally. But if you know your system, you can do something like this. And there's lots of other parameters that you can set, properties through this kind of mechanism. So you can alter the role within the database connection, and it will apply those at connection time. So another good use case for how roles can be helpful and work. All right, I'm going to keep going unless someone interrupts. And here we go. So special roles. So the super user, you would hope, especially in our day and age of 2025 and our security conscious mindset, that anything like a super user or what we would refer to as root in Linux or something of that nature, might have some sensible limitations in some way. Like even though I'm logged in as root, I have to at least do something before I can just torch everyone's files and everything in the world. And that is not how, so our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man would be responsible with everything. But unfortunately, the root user is really not that. It has complete privilege and authority to do anything whatsoever in the database. And so if you are a super user, and by default, that Postgres, that initial user is a super user on a general Postgres installation, talk about some differences in the cloud in just a minute. It has once you're connected, there are no security checks. Essentially in code, any place, it's not literal, but generally in code, any place that we would say, hey, does this role have the delete from table privilege, as it were? It says, is this a super user or does the role have delete privilege? So basically, anytime a super user can do anything to any database that it can connect to any tables, schemas, and so forth. So there's no limit on what a super user can do. That's why it's really essential that you use the super user role with caution. The problem is most of us get started with Postgres. We don't understand some of these things. I certainly didn't. I spin up a Docker container. I connect as Postgres and I set a password because it's easy and fast. And I start creating tables and doing lots of stuff. And I never run into a problem because I'm a super user. I can do whatever I want. And then I try and take that same schema, throw it up in Amazon or throw it up in Azure, and my user's no longer a super user, and I start getting errors because I don't have privileges that I had previously. And so it's just something to recognize that using super user can really lead you down a path of not understanding that you're actually able to do a whole lot more than you probably would be able to otherwise. So most cloud providers don't give you this access. They give you a super user-like role, and that's for good reason, right? They have a lot they have to manage and be responsible for, and so they create something that's more super user-like. And I would say this is kind of our Captain America, really trustworthy, has all the right amount of power, but not enough that it can destroy the world, right? And so we would say generally the community has said over the last few years, if you really need kind of that almost super user level privilege, create a role that has create role and create DB. Because if I can create the database and create other roles, I can do things like grant privileges, manage the database, create schemas, all of those kinds of things, and kind of get the process set up correctly. It allows you to manage just about everything you need to with a couple limitations. The nice thing is, over the last few releases and continuing into the future, the Postgres community and the developers are working hard to provide better privilege and attribute mechanisms to do things that a super user used to be able, you used to need to be a super user to do. An example might be extensions. Extensions are really powerful in Postgres. It is probably one of the sole reasons Postgres has become so popular and can do so many really pretty amazing things. But for good reasons, some of them have security limitations, and you have to be a super user to install them. There's kind of a, that's the only switch we get. Do you have to be a super user or don't you? And so the community has been talking, and this would be a role that hopefully soon you can say, hey, this user can install limited extensions, even though they're not a super user. Things like resetting statistics in the database. You used to have to be a super user. There's now some attributes for some of those kinds of processes, things like that. So we are continuing to add mechanisms to make this a lot easier to manage without having to be super user, and really limiting the needs for that role to something really, really small. All right, so those are the various roles. Now that we know that we can connect to a server, we've gone through the HBA process. We've been able to, our host has been able to connect. We have a database that we're allowed to connect to. We have a role that we've created that has the right privileges. Now we actually need to discuss, how can this work within the database itself? I can connect, but what can I as this role do? And so privileges are really those set of access rights within the database schemas and the objects themselves. And so, as you would expect, they can be granted or revoked with the grant and revoke statement, just as you would see in SQL Server or other relational databases. And I'm going to repeat this probably twice, I think, in the slide deck. But as, again, just to recognize, when I say grant, even something as permissive as grant select on schema public to all tables to role public or whatever that might be, trying to give everybody access to every table so they can select the data. As soon as I create another table, that thing did not exist at the time I executed the grant statement. And so I need to kind of redo this all over again. You'll see that in just a few minutes. These are the privileges currently in existence in Postgres 15 plus. They actually haven't changed in quite a while. When I create a role, as of Postgres 15 and above, the role gets the connect, temporary, execute, and usage privilege by default. And it gets that privilege through, next slide, the public role. So the public role is a role that cannot be deleted. Much like super user, it kind of exists in code. It is it's a role that just always exists, and every role you create is automatically a member of public, and you can't remove it from public. So you need to manage the public privileges to make sure that they match what you want. So by default, when I spin up a brand new database, the public role, a group role, essentially, no one can log in as it, has the connect, usage, temporary, and execute privilege. Therefore, as a member of the public role, I can connect to a database. I can use the database, use temporary space, and execute functions. Now, just because I can connect doesn't mean I can actually see anything, right? That is just the connection. It doesn't mean I have select privilege. So I can see the database, but it doesn't mean I can do anything else. I might even be able to see the tables and the functions, but I can't do anything with those tables. If I really want someone to not see a database, I have to remove their connect privilege from that database. All right. So again, that's a nuance that is hard to describe. I've been in a couple situations over the last few years where, I'm working for a company, whether it be Redgate or Timescale or others, where we have a public, maybe tool we want to demo. And I just was telling someone this yesterday. It makes a lot of sense that your DevOps folks, and you say, hey, I want to create a public Postgres database that only has select privilege, and just so people can connect and kind of get a sense for how our tool works. And most folks say, no, I'd never do that. We're not going to let you do that because that's a security. Well, it really is possible. I can say, like, they can only connect, and I can only grant them select, and they have no other possibility of doing anything else, as long as you set up the HBA file and so forth appropriately. So just knowing all the nuances of each step and kind of what has to happen to go through. In Postgres 14 or below, users also had the create privilege on the public role. And it turns out, after all these years, kind of discovered that was a bad thing. And so from Postgres 15 and above, by default, you do not have the create privilege on the public schema. If you are upgrading from something before 15, you actually have to remove it from all of your users. And the general recommendation is you do. That's a separate talk, but there is a possible security opportunity for someone to take advantage of if they can create things in the public schema by default. And a lot of that comes down to extensions. And again, most of those over the last 3 or 4 years, there's a big community effort to make those more secure when it comes to privileges. So everything's kind of working together, but it is a potential. And so generally, we recommend that you don't allow people, the public role specifically, to create objects. You give out the specific privilege to the roles that you need to create objects within your database. And you'll see that in just a couple more minutes in the demo. So this is security best practice. This still goes. I spin up a new database. Generally, when it's production ready, I would say, get started by revoking all privileges to public and all privileges in the database. Basically, this says, hey, no one can create schemas, or no one can create objects in the public schema, which I can't get rid of, without talking to, without getting that privilege specifically. And just make sure that you're actually granting those specifically. And so as far as granting goes, there's lots. I'll point on 2 more slides where you can go read up on all of the various grant privileges and what they do based on the object type. But this should look really familiar, right? We know what grant statements are. So in this case, we're granting create on database, this database to this role. And so that means in this database, the admin1 user could now create schemas. Right, so that's what the create on a database does. Now, once I'm in a schema granting usage and create, it means that I can create objects in that schema. Now, you'll see in a second, ownership of an object like a schema, even though schema isn't really an object, let's just pretend it is. When I own an object, I am a super user of that object. So in this case, admin1, because they can create a new schema, they would be the owner of the schema, and they can create objects in there. I don't have to give them specific permission. And then, maybe some other roles, you just want to do things like select, insert, update, and you kind of go from there. So these make sense. Revoke is just the opposite, right? What you would expect. And there's good documentation and all that. And I'll just say this one more time. Often what I have seen, and I did years ago, is I would have developers creating things with their roles, right? Maybe in a dev database. I saw this a lot. I think, well, hey, this is better if I just give out individual, and it probably is, sorry, I should mention that, probably is good to give out individual logins to your developers so you know who's doing what. But they would be creating their own objects, and maybe someone else couldn't do something with it. And so we'd say, oh, let's just grant all on all tables to the schema. And it would work, and we'd go on with our day. And then someone would create a new object later and go on vacation. And then nobody, unless we had a super user, could actually do anything with it. And so just recognize that when you execute the grant statement, it's only going to affect the objects that currently exist. If I create a new one later, I have to do it again, right? I have to grant privileges as I go. And that's generally the idea of principle of least privilege, right? So only grant what's necessary, as little as you can. These links will be in the slides. These really basically what this says is the first link is for each of the privileges, like select, update, insert, based on the object type. So when I say create on a schema gives you this kind of privilege, create on a database gives you this ability. And so that first link will kind of review those, and then how to actually grant them or revoke them is the actual pages themselves. All right. All right, so now let's actually talk about inheritance really quickly. This becomes really key to how we manage ownership and why this is so important. So roles can be granted membership into another role, right? So I can be granted privileges, select, insert, update, delete, and so forth. And I can be granted another role, which means I'm now a member of that other role, as long as that role has permission to grant membership into it. And that's where the create role is part of that property. And then if any role has inherit set, that's one of the attributes we saw earlier, and by default it is set, they automatically inherit the privileges of all the other roles they're a member of. And then at runtime, depending on the object, Postgres basically does its thing and tries to figure out, is this role allowed to do this thing on this object that it might not own because it's a member of the owner of the object, as it were. And so that's what inherit does. It can be really useful. It can at times be a little bit confusing if you don't manage it well. However, this is generally how we recommend you manage group privileges, right? So I wouldn't generally, grant select, as it were, as a quick example, to all of my developers on all of my dev databases. That's a lot of work to say, grant so-and-so to this role, grant so-and-so to the next role. It's just too much. And so what we would say is, hey, create a group for read-only, and that's your select privilege. And then just grant the various roles that you want to be able to select from these tables into that role. And then you manage the various privileges at the group level. And then you don't have to worry so much about the individual users. And if you remove them from a group, they lose a privilege, and that's a good thing. And so basically, if I have two, let's say I guess this case, 4 roles, right? I have a senior dev, a report user, which are login. They're actual roles that can do something. And then we have admin and read-only priv. Those are groups because they can't log in. And then if I say, hey, grant, admin and read-only privilege to senior dev. So now everyone can they can do both of those things, and then grant read-only privilege to the report user. It's a way of kind of separating these things out. So then I simply manage, as you can see in the middle, right? So for the admin group role, I granted insert, update, delete on all tables, and then I grant select to the read-only privilege group role. And then with the inheritance, that's how I can manage these things. In a really simple Venn diagram, we would say that both the report user and the senior dev have the read-only privilege. And then because senior dev got added or was admitted into the admin group, it also then has select, insert, update, and delete on the app schema. All right. There are some nuances in how to really see all of, and this is getting better in more recent versions, but this is one of the limitations of like very quickly seeing, hey, show me senior dev, every object, every privilege. It's possible. It is challenging at times. There are ways to see it within the command line tool PSQL, depending on the the IDE that you use. A number of them now are doing better with showing this. So it is one of these things that, having your scripts, like when I would be at Redgate and talk about Flyway, or been doing migrations for years, right? Whatever you're using for migrations, having your roles and privileges pulled out into maybe a separate script that you can track over time is a good way just to make sure, hey, during deployments, did that script that manages these kinds of privileges change? And that's how I generally recommend people do that when they're doing things like Flyway and migrations. And then from that, now that we see what groups and roles can do and how they have membership and the privileges you can assign, we talk about object ownership. And then we're going to have the demo that hopefully brings this all together. So objects are owned by roles, and the object owner is essentially a super user of that object. And again, we come back to that principle of least privilege. Just because I have been given select privilege on every table in this database, on every schema, as soon as someone creates a brand new table, unless I have been given privilege again, I can't do a thing unless you follow what we're about to talk about. And so that's been a problem over the years, right? It means that every time you create an object, you had to make sure that you had all of the correct grant statements for selects and updates and deletes and who can do what. And that's a lot of work. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just a lot of work. And so Postgres has this concept of default privileges, which is specifically around object creation. And so as a role, I can say when I create an object, give all of these other roles these kinds of privileges so that I don't have to then also go back and make sure I've run all the grant statements appropriately or revoke, whatever that might look like. And so default privileges have been around for quite a long time. And it's something that honestly, I always recommend you choose to manage. It's a lot, it's just a lot of learning within Postgres, but I still believe this is the best way to manage how object creation flows over time. Unless you really do want to manage it manually and see all of the appropriate grant statements and so forth within your database as you do migrations, you're welcome to do that. You just have to decide your path forward. But as soon as someone creates a table and they forget to run the grant, you'll probably come back to default privileges because you recognize it's worth the effort to at least attempt to manage and see a path forward with it. So what does that look like? What I generally recommend is something like this. So what this slide is trying to demonstrate is I have a database with all of these objects, right? I have tables and functions and so forth, and they're all owned by different roles. And so depending on who's connecting, that depends on who can access it, who can manage it, all of those things. And this becomes a lot to deal with, right? If dev 1 creates objects and doesn't do the right thing, and dev 2 creates objects and does do the right thing, then you have just a mismatch of stuff within your database. It's not fun for anybody. And so with default privileges, we can say, as a really simple example, hey, as this user, or as this role, maybe it's I generally do something like a DDL admin role. So that role is going to own all of the objects in my database. It can't log in. It's just a role that I use during my deployments so that I create objects as that role, and I can manage the default privileges through that. And so I might say, as the DDL admin, hey, alter my default privileges and grant select on tables to the public role. So now whenever I create a table, as long as a role is a member of public, which we talked about earlier, all roles are a member of public, they should be able to select from my table now. Now, maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I create a different role that's a group and I have all, you kind of manage it that way. But then I don't have to think about it. Whenever I create a table, as long as I am that role that created this default privilege, then they'll get access and I won't get that, why can't I select from this table? And so what I then recommend is generally, I do recommend people start with a couple of group roles. And if you're working on particularly a new application in a new Postgres database, I would say, hey, use something like DDL admin role. And with your scripts, make sure that script is running. There's various ways to do that as that group role that has set up all the correct default privileges. And now the great thing is all of your objects are owned by the role that you know. I could be a member of that role so that if I need to later on, I can come in and fix something. And as that role is creating these objects, all the correct privileges are being applied. So hopefully that symbiotic kind of relationship of these things together can really work together and help. So about to go do a demo. Time is actually doing pretty good right now. Again, just to review what those are. Again, we can do explicit grant statements after the object is created, or every so often just say grant all to everybody, or whatever you need to do. We can alter the default privileges, which is generally what I recommend people work towards. If you do the default privileges, then basically you'll see in my script here that I'm about to show you, you can actually maybe at the top of your migration scripts or on the migration connection, you set the role of that connection to your DDL admin, again, whatever you might call that role. And that way the script runs as that role and all the objects get created as that role and all the correct privileges get applied and so forth. There is another option starting with Postgres 14 Plus, and this is actually the issue I was talking about at the very beginning. A current user is asking us a question about read all data. So with Postgres 14 and above, almost every release, there are more, we call these predefined roles, and we are adding more and more of them. And I say I'm not a core developer by any stretch. I just like Postgres a ton, and I've been using it for a long time, and I love it. But the developers have been adding these predefined roles. One is read all data. And so that allows any role that has that attribute, that privilege, part of that predefined role, to select data from everything in every database that it has access to. So something to be aware of. So let's go ahead and do a demo and hope that this clears everything up of what I just talked about. So I have an empty database. It doesn't really matter that it's empty. And this is actually a pretty brand new Postgres Docker image I have, so I have not created these roles yet. Remember, roles are a cluster level, aka instance level thing, but they need a database to connect to do anything else, right? And so they have a couple cluster level attributes. Can they create databases? Can they create other roles? A couple of those things. And then once they have a database and they have access to that database, we have to set up all of our other grants and privileges there. So we're going to create our group role. It's a group role because it has no login. And I am using dbeaver. I like dbeaver as a tool. It's just it's a whole nother discussion, but that's what I tend to use. And so much like SSMS, instead of F5, I am hitting Command, I'm on a Mac. So Command Enter, and I'm executing the statements that my cursor is inside of. dbeaver understands that little semicolon and it doesn't run the whole script, which I really like. All right, so I have that role. And during my connection, I'm connected to a database. At any time, I can say set role to another role that I have membership in. So I'm currently connected as Postgres, the super user. And then anytime I have switched to another role that I have access to, if I want to go back to whatever the original connection role was, I just say set none. And that goes back to the original session role, whatever that was. So just to make sure I'm there, I do that. Now in this case, I am a super user. And so I can just say, hey, I've created the developer group. I'm going to grant select, insert, update, delete on all tables in schema public to developer. And then I'm going to go ahead and say that they can create objects on the public schema. So cool. So I have a group role that can't log in. What good is that? We'll see in just a minute. Let's create two more. So we are going to create just regular login roles, developer 1 and developer 2. And we're going to grant developer 1 and 2 membership into that group role developer. So we can say grant the developer role to each of these other roles. All right, so now I have 3 roles. Developer is a group, dev1 and dev2 are, again, quote unquote users. I have not explicitly given dev1 and dev2 any privileges at all. I have not said grant select to dev1, grant select to dev. I haven't done that. I granted it to the group role, and then I gave them membership into the developer role. So because developer has that privilege and dev1 and 2 are inheriting, they can go ahead and select from other tables. Generally, you'll see there's some nuance here. So again, I am currently the Postgres user. I have super level privileges. Let's pretend that I am logged in as dev1. And so I'm just going to say set role to dev1. And so my dev1 creates a new table. It just has one column of text. And I can see that that role right here does own that table. Cool. Now, dev2 is doing some work later in the day. And it says, we've got to add this other column to the table. We're both developers. We're both members of the developer role. If I was in SSMS, if I was in SQL Server, and we both had the same privileges, the same capabilities within the database, this should be pretty easy most of the time, right? But as soon as I try and alter that table, I get a very common error. You must be the owner of the table to do anything to it, right? So if you're not a super user or you're not the owner, you can't do anything to this object. I can't modify a function if I don't own it. I can't alter a table. I can't remove something from the table. You know, I don't have the ability to alter and do things to it. That's a little bit of a hassle. And so the way that we generally get around this in Postgres, we try and manage this. Again, I'm going to go back to my super user role because that's what I'm connected as. Just makes it easy to drop the table. I could have dropped it as dev1, right? Because only dev1 can drop that table or a super user. So this is a quick way to bypass it. So the way around this is to say, wait a second. Both of my developers are part of both of my devs are part of the developer role. Well, what if the developer group role, this thing that can't log in, what if it created the tables? And so this is where I would say, like in a migration script, I would often have as my first line or as part of the connection variables, I would say, hey, set the role of this connection after I'm connected. I connect as Postgres. And the next thing you do is set the role for this session to your object owner role. In this case, I'm saying developer. Maybe it's DDL admin. Maybe it's app admin, app table owner, whatever you're going to call the thing. And so if I do that, so now this session from this moment forward is running as if I'm the developer group role. Even though I couldn't log in, I have like shifted over and I've become that group role. And now when I create that new table with one column, and I see that it is now owned by that developer role, Now dev2, or quite honestly dev1, can alter that table and I don't get the error. And you'll see that I have two columns, column 1 and column 2. And so that's where the membership, inheritance, and ownership just really becomes important. So in 2 minutes, let me show you the last piece of this, and then we'll be ready for some questions. So we have groups, we have users, as it were. Now let's do one other quick thing. Let's pretend that we have this app and we've decided that we really need a reporting user because there's a new requirement to have a minute. Just want them to have the select privilege. And so again, I'm going to go back to my super user so I can create this new role. And I create it as a login role. Maybe my Power BI software is going to, I just said Power BI, you know what Power BI is. Maybe Power BI is going to connect as this report user to run some of those reports. And so again, anytime I say set role, you have to imagine I'm connecting as that role. So I'm just going to shift over and pretend to be the report user for a minute. So maybe Power BI connects as report user and I say, hey, select from that really cool new table. And we get permission denied. Because the developer role created the table, the dev roles are part of that group, and so it can select from it just fine because I inherit from the groups I'm a part of. However, I didn't give any other grant select statements. I just didn't do it. So report user has no privilege on this table yet. Principle of least privilege. It's how we function. So one way around it is to say, all right, now I have to be the owner of the table to do something with it. So I connect as developer and I grant select. I couldn't say, as any user, I can't just say grant select on this thing. I have to be the owner of that table. So now that I've granted that privilege to the report user, I can go back and now the report user can select to it even though I've done nothing else, right? That was a specific point in time grant. Again, that can be a little bit frustrating, especially if later in my development process, the developer role creates my new reporting table. And if I haven't given that privilege out, the report user gets stuck again, right? So every time I create objects, I have to check these things. So the last thing to show you and the one path forward is those default privileges. And so I'm going to, whoops, that one, okay. I'm going to go ahead and drop that table. And then we're going to do it this way instead. So as I said in that slide, as the role that's going to create all of the various objects, tables, functions, and so forth, I can say whenever I create an object, apply these default privileges. So I'm going to go ahead and set myself back to the developer role. It's just a group role, right? I haven't logged in as them. It's just because I'm a member, I can switch over to that role. So as the developer role, I'm going to say, hey, alter my default privileges, grant select on all the tables I create to the report user. And then go ahead and create a table, right? I haven't done anything else. I haven't applied any other grant statements, but if I go back to my report user, I now can select from that table. So that's super high level. There's a lot going on there. Again, these scripts are available in the repo, but just understanding those basic concepts of what a role is, how the attribute level attributes work, and then the database specific privileges work, inheritance and ownership. That is so key to managing your Postgres database as well. Just to say the last thing to mention are the predefined roles. We started adding more of these in Postgres 14 plus. One of the big examples we see a lot of is read all data. This is just like granting select on every table in your database. Now it's a role level attribute. So when I grant my role membership into the predefined role of read all data, any database I can connect to, I will now have select privilege on all the tables. This is really good for monitoring software. It's something I see in many cases, right? We know that we're not going to be able to modify data, and we need to be able to read things like column statistics and so forth, which are on tables, which require the select privilege. So this is you might see a lot of your monitoring solutions ask you to apply read all data. I could just as well go table by table and execute grant statements to the monitoring user. It's one or the other. Like you can do what you want. I wouldn't generally apply the PG write all data. That seems really bad to me, but it is possible. We do have that new predefined role. You can see what these predefined roles are. Again, we're trying to add some as we go. So things like you used to have to be a super user to execute a checkpoint command. And now you could, for instance, say, give membership into the PG checkpoint role. Read server files, things like that. Again, I don't have to be a super user anymore. As long as the role I'm connecting to can read the files, things like to be able to do copy and so forth, I can actually do some of those things without being a super user, which is a good thing. So hopefully that is a good, quick overview. I know it's a lot of information. I'm glad this is being recorded. You can watch it over again. But if there are questions, I am happy to answer them. And again, you can find this on my Postgres repo. I'm going to go back to the top and show you this again. If you want to download the book, please feel free to do that. Just follow the bit.ly and go from there.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
You're
this
welcome.
is really awesome. Yeah.
Good. Hope it was helpful.
Cool. Yeah. And yeah, it was really great. Actually, I am -5, not even 0 on Postgres. So this would really be a great way to go. And I think luckily Grant had done this for us some time back.
Okay, good.
But yeah, thank you so much, guys. If you have any questions, usually the most popular one is, what is the link to your YouTube video? And that I'll post again.
Okay.
Oh, come on. How do I copy the link? Yeah, well, somewhere I'll post it again. Don't worry.
Which link?
I'll answer.
I did post.
Yeah, I know, but okay. So I saw you posted it a few minutes back, right? Cool. But I'm going to stop the recording now. If there's no more questions, we can definitely.
I did put a question. I don't know if Ryan can see that. So
is that the read all? Let's see. PG write all data to